Okay, so I'm not going to be writing on here today. I'm just going to be talking you through what you need to write. So we are on Act 4 now. And remember, we've just gotten we've just gotten past the point where Lennox is having a discussion about the fact that no one actually trusts Macbeth anymore. So this is where we're going to get more into why Macbeth is so confident, because as the audience, we know that people no longer trust him. However, we know that Macbeth has a downfall. You know, the play is a tragedy, which must mean that Macbeth has a downfall. And this is the point at which we start to realise what Macbeth's downfall is, and that is his hubris, his overconfidence, his sort of ability to believe in himself when others don't, and actually how that's quite foolish. So we're in an isolated place and we're in thunder. This is where you would annotate up here as well. That's pathetic fallacy. Now remember at the beginning where it says, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning or in rain? And actually they're meeting in thunder. Now thunder, again, what you want to write down, it has connotations of sort of aggressiveness. It's meant to be quite loud, it's meant to be quite disruptive, and that's what the witches are doing here. They're disrupting what's going on with Macbeth. So they start talking, and I know that you guys can read through this, and you will actually see that there are quite a lot of very, very famous lines in here, like double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn and cauldron, bubble. But you will look at what they're putting in. So they're putting in things like poisoned entrails. So these are parts of animals or people, really. So like the innards, the sort of intestines and things. And then you'll notice they're putting in things from toads and things like that. Now this is really meant to emphasize how the witches are evil. So this is the symbolism here. It's meant to show that these witches are very, very evil. They put in a snake, which is interesting as well, because it could symbolise Macbeth being the betrayer, because remember the snake in the Bible was the devil to betray God, so don't forget, you need to write that down. And we've all heard eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. That's used in a lot of films now when they're talking about witches as well. Again, they're talking about an adder, so that's another snake. It's quite interesting that they're putting two snakes in as well. And they talk about it as a hell broth, which I think is really interesting because, again, it's sort of linking the witches to evil, and it's emphasising that. And so then we move on to of the raven, salt sea shark, the root of hemlock digged in the dark, and then we say the liver of blaspheming Jew. Now at the time people were very anti-Semitic in Shakespearean times, so the reason that they call them blaspheming, or Jewish people blaspheming, is because of they didn't believe in Christ being the Son of God, and they blamed Jewish people for the slaughter, for the death of Christ, which it was something that was very, very wrong in society. It was very horrendous for a lot of Jewish people. So actually, the reason that Shakespeare's doing this is because he's playing on that anti-Semitic viewpoint, and he's actually pointing out here as well, it kind of symbolises the fact that Macbeth blasphemes as well, doesn't he? He talks about hell coming to earth, like come night and scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. So he's quite blasphemous, isn't he, as well? So you might want to write down over here that that's what it symbolises. They talk about the nose of Turk, Tartar's lips. Again, it's just a very racist speech. That's the point here. That they're talking about all the people that you can't trust. I'm doing air quotes there, in Shakespearean times, which is interesting because, again, it's they don't trust Macbeth. Now, then we go on to ditch delivered by a drab. So the finger of a birth-strangled babe, meaning a babe that was strangled at birth. So a baby that someone has strangled as soon as they've given birth to it. delivered in a ditch by a prostitute. So again, it's become very offensive as well. It shames a lot of groups in society, and it's quite shocking, and it's quite horrendous as well here. So they're putting in all these terrible ingredients to really symbolize how evil the spell is that they're concocting. So again, it's giving us that idea of chaos. We want to write that down, that idea of chaos. And they keep saying double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn and cauldron, bubble. And then enter Hecate, or Hecate, sorry, as they pronounce it in Shakespearean times. And she comes in to talk just before Macbeth comes in. Now, she says that she's happy. She says that this is what she wants to happen. So again, we're seeing that the witches control a lot of what happens to Macbeth. And the second witch actually says, by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. Now, it's interesting that then Macbeth comes in. So even the witches who are doing all these horrendous things, who have all these disgusting ingredients, even they use the adjective wicked to describe Macbeth. Now, that's really interesting. That's used to emphasise that idea of Macbeth being evil. Make sure you've made a note of that. And so you will notice in your books that you have this picture of Macbeth with the witches, and this is where they're trying to influence him. So Macbeth actually comes in and says, how now, you secret black and midnight hags, what is it you do? A deed without a name. So he's coming in at this point in time because he's relying on the witches to tell him things. So he starts up by saying, I conjure you. Now, to conjure is also to sort of perform magic yourself. So it's almost like Macbeth is trying to make himself like an equal to the witches. Make sure you've written that down. So he's trying to make himself like an equal to the witches here, which is one way you could read that. He also says, however you come to know it, answer me. Though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches. Now, that's really interesting, because Macbeth is basically saying here, he is happy for the witches to tell him what he wants to know, even if it ruins the natural order. So look at, even if you have to make the wind so terrible that they actually destroy the churches. So look at the symbolism there. Make sure you've made a note of it as well. The symbolism here of destroying churches, you know, Macbeth is happy to destroy, you know, the very thing that sort of people are influenced by at the time, their god. Though the yeasty waves confound and swallow navigation up. So he's talking there about, like, you know, all the ships that would bring in food and supplies. He's talking about, like, how they can't even navigate themselves and they'll be swallowed by the waves. So he's risking his country as well, isn't he? Make sure you've explained that. And he talks about, you know, trees being blown down, castles toppled on their warders' heads. Now, that's really interesting. So the person in the castle, it can topple on their head. So again, it's very much like betraying the noblemen there, because they would live in the castles. What he's saying, even till destruction sicken. So I don't mind if everything is destroyed as long as I get what I want. So this entire speech is meant to be sort of symbolic of Macbeth's selfish nature. And then they talk like, speak, demand, will answer. Would you rather hear it from us or our master? Call them. So call the masters of evil, which is, again, it's almost like Macbeth is like asking to sort of consult with the devil here. Now, the next part of this scene is going to become really symbolic. So if you haven't read it, I need you to read it. I need you to pause this video now and I need you to read it, because we need to go through the symbolism of each of the they call up sort of like visions for Macbeth to see. So we need to go over what each vision shows, okay? So make sure you paused it if you haven't. Okay, right, so the first apparition. So the first apparition is actually an armoured head, okay? So you can see it actually says an armoured head, and you can see down here, right? So a helmeted head. Now, Macbeth is a soldier, remember? And this one actually tells him to beware Macduff. Can you see that? Now, what becomes really interesting here is when he says beware Macduff and he's an armoured head, it foreshadows a battle between Macbeth and Macduff. But what I find really interesting about this is that the last time Macbeth was shown to be a soldier, he was a good soldier. He won his battle. And now they're telling him to beware Macduff, almost like he's in danger. So then Macbeth says actually one word more. So you can see where Macbeth thinks he's in control of this situation. But the first witch actually says he'll be not commanded. So Macbeth isn't as in control as Macbeth seems, because remember, Macbeth is very, very confident at this point. Overconfident, some might say. So then there's thunder, and enter the second apparition, a bloody child. Now, we're going to find this one really, really interesting, because the second apparition actually says, be bloody, bold, and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Okay? So then Macbeth decides to let Macduff live. He's like, I'm not going to kill you, you can't hurt me. But I'll just be double sure and I'll kill you. So again, it's showing that here Macbeth is very, very, he wants to be violent, doesn't he? So remember when he said, you know, I've got so much blood on my hands, I may as well keep going because it's going to be just as bad to try and go back. So I may as well just keep killing people. So here we can see where Macbeth's thoughts always sort of turn to murder. Now, the bloody child is a really interesting one. So I'm going to give you a bit of a spoiler here. So he says, none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And what that means is no one who's been birthed by a woman. Now, there are ways for a woman to give birth without actually having given birth, which would be like a cesarean section. Nowadays, that's what you would know it as. At the time, if the mother died in childbirth, then and the baby wasn't coming out, and they knew the mother was dead, then they would try to save the child by opening up the mother's womb via surgery, basically slicing her open and taking the child out. Now, that is how Macduff was born. So later on, that's what we find out, that Macduff was born by C-section, by cesarean. And the fact that it's a bloody child actually shows that the witches are tricking him. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Yes, I mean, that's technically true, but it's also misleading. So it's causing Macbeth to be very, very overconfident. And we want to explain that on here as well. We want to annotate that and explain it. So it's causing Macbeth to be very overconfident. They're trying to mislead him. Okay, that's what we need to write down. Now, remember, that kind of links back to the beginning where Banquo actually says, you know, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. They tell us things that seem true. So the next person, or the next apparition, so the next sort of ghost vision, is a child crowned with a tree in his hand. And so basically he's saying, you know, it comes in with a crown, like a round and top of sovereignty. And it talks about Macbeth shall never be vanquished until, oh, I've gone too far, until great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. So basically he's saying you won't be vanquished until the woods march on the castle. Which again is very misleading, and you'll see why a bit later. Now, the fact that it's a child with a tree in its hand is really, really interesting, because remember, things grow from trees, and Macbeth is most afraid of at this point in time, not just of dying, but of not having his own sons take over the crown. So actually, a child with a tree in its hand almost symbolises Macbeth's own insecurity, and I want you to write this down. It symbolises Macbeth's own insecurity in himself, like he's so insecure that he's not going to have children that are going to take the crown. And that becomes really, really interesting, because we know that Macbeth, we know that Macbeth will do anything to keep the crown in his family. So I find that a really, really interesting vision. And I think it links to the last vision. It says, enter a show of 8 kings, and the last with a glass in his hand, meaning a mirror, and the Banquo's ghost following them. And this one actually obviously doesn't really speak to him, but it scares him. And that's because what it actually shows you is all these kings followed by the ghost of Banquo, who is up here, because you notice he's the only one not wearing a crown. And that means that these are actually all of Banquo's sons who will be kings. And there's a mirror, meaning that there'll be many, many more to come. So this is intended as a bit of a compliment to James I, who said that he descended from a man called Banquo. So the whole point here is to sort of say, you know, there will be many, many kings after James I, all from his line. You know, all his sons and their sons and their sons will be kings. But what's the most interesting about this is that it is actually showing that Macbeth's nightmare will come to pass, and it's foreshadowing that. But it also spurs Macbeth on to be more violent and to fight more, which again makes him really, really reckless. Like if you keep fighting even when you can't win, it's quite reckless, isn't it? It's reckless with your own life. So the witches are tricking Macbeth to kind of push him into thinking that he needs to keep working, he needs to keep fighting. And actually Macbeth says, will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? Meaning it looks like it's going to last forever. And it also says, twofold bulls and treble scepters carry. Now this is interesting again because I think I've referenced this in one of my videos before. Do you remember that moment in Frozen, if you've ever seen Frozen, where she's carrying like a ball and a scepter, like a scepter's like a stick? And she's carrying them to be coronated as part of her becoming queen. Now, if you're carrying more than one ball or a scepter with more than one head on it, then actually what that means is you are the king of more than one country. So it means not only are Banquo's children going to take the throne from Macbeth, but they're also going to be more successful than Macbeth. And that's really, really interesting as well, because James I was King of Scotland at first, and then he was King of England, and so he united the two countries. So you'll notice it here, it talks about the treble scepter, the crown, England, Scotland and Wales. Well, that's actually really, really interesting because, again, it's sort of like a compliment to James I here, as in Macbeth can never stay king because we have our rightful king in. And that's sort of where everyone goes out, and then Lennox comes in. And Macbeth actually says, you know, saw you the weird sisters, and Lennox says, saw you the weird sisters, there you go. And Lennox says, no, my lord. So Lennox is actually basically saying, you know, no, I didn't see them. So it kind of makes Macbeth, again, seem quite strange and seem mad as well. And then Macbeth says something that's really interesting. Damned all those that trust them. And I find that interesting there because he's almost... He's damning himself, and when you damn someone, you damn them to hell. So it's quite interesting that he's damning himself here, and he's pointing out that he doesn't trust anyone who trusts witches, but he trusts witches. So again, it shows Macbeth's gone quite mad here, and almost like he's got so much confidence in himself that he thinks that he's the exception to the rule. So make sure we're writing these things down. And that's really what's interesting. Now, Macbeth also then talks about, he talks to himself about how he's going to kill Macduff. And he talks here about, from this moment, the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand. Which basically means he is saying, I will do everything now As soon as I think it. As soon as I think it, I'll do it. Now, we know, again, that's really reckless behaviour as well, isn't it? So make sure you've written that down, that's quite reckless behaviour. Because he's saying he's not going to think things through anymore, which, again, he's so confident in himself that he's not going to think things through. And actually, when he kills Macduff's family, that's what causes Macduff to come and seek revenge on Macbeth. So it's his own downfall. He's too confident in himself, isn't he? He thinks too much of himself. And he talks about, you know, I will surprise the castle of Macduff, and I will kill his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line. So I'm not just going to kill Macduff. I'm going to, well, he can't kill Macduff because Macduff has gone to England, but he's going to murder everyone in Macduff's family. Which is, again, a very, very vicious and cruel act. And that's the impression we're getting from Macbeth here. So he's so confident in himself that he thinks he can act viciously and cruelly. So we'll move on to scene 2 after. Make sure you've made all these notes, make sure you've annotated, and make sure you've paused the video so you've got everything I've said written down.